The Gordie Howe International Bridge may be delayed. President Trump is threatening its opening, claiming Canada isn't treating the U.S. with fairness and respect when it comes to how this bridge is paid for.
Now, the Prime Minister was asked about Trump's bridge ultimatum as he head into cabinet earlier today. Here's what Mark Carney had to say about a call he had with the U.S. president.
U.S. President Donald Trump is making a new threat against Canada tonight, taking aim at a new border crossing. The Gordie Howe Bridge will connect Windsor, Ontario and Detroit, and it's set to open this year.
You know, a trade fight is getting serious when a bridge suddenly becomes political dynamite. Not tariffs, not speeches, not campaign rallies. An actual bridge sitting between Detroit and Windsor that carries the weight of factories, farms, auto plants, and nearly a quarter of all trade between Canada and the United States. And when Donald Trump publicly threatened to block it from opening, Washington probably expected Canada to panic, argue, or cave under pressure. Instead, Mark Carney responded with something far more dangerous in politics: paperwork, contracts, hard numbers, and a reminder that the entire project had already been legally locked in years earlier. What made the situation so explosive was the fact that the Gordie Howe International Bridge was never supposed to become a political battlefield in the first place. This was a project that had already survived more than a decade of court fights, lobbying wars, environmental approvals, funding disputes, and pressure campaigns from some of the most powerful business interests in Michigan. By the time construction crews were finishing the final stages in 2026, most people assumed the hard part was over. Then on February 9th, 2026, Trump posted on Truth Social claiming Canada effectively controlled both sides of the bridge and suggested the United States should receive compensation before allowing it to open. Tying the issue to broader trade frustrations involving Ontario alcohol restrictions, Canadian dairy protections, and Carney's expanding trade relationship with China. Suddenly, a bridge that had been sold to the public as infrastructure became leverage in a much larger economic power struggle. The timing caught even seasoned political observers off guard because Trump himself had previously supported the project during his first presidency. Back in 2019, he signed legislation that included the first American funding connected to the bridge, roughly $15 million for customs and border protection systems on the U.S. side. Years earlier, the U.S. State Department had already issued the presidential permit in April 2013, allowing construction to move forward, and the project had bipartisan support stretching across multiple administrations in both countries. This was not some secret deal hidden from Washington. The legal framework had been negotiated publicly under a 2012 agreement between Canada and Michigan, signed by then Republican Governor Rick Snyder, who openly acknowledged that Michigan could not finance the crossing itself and that Canada was stepping in to make the project possible. The arrangement gave Michigan shared ownership without requiring the state to front billions in construction costs, while Canada would recover its investment gradually through toll revenue over time. That financial structure matters because the numbers involved are enormous. The Gordie Howe International Bridge and its surrounding infrastructure carry a total long-term project cost of roughly 6.4 billion Canadian dollars, including the bridge itself, customs facilities, highway interchanges, and maintenance commitments extending decades into the future. Canada financed virtually the entire thing, including major infrastructure on the American side in Detroit's Delray neighborhood, after years of political deadlock in Michigan blocked state funding. Under the agreement, toll revenue would eventually repay those costs, and once the investment was recovered, Michigan would still receive half of the net toll proceeds going forward. In other words, Michigan secured joint ownership of one of North America's most important trade crossings without paying upfront construction costs, which is exactly why Rick Snyder reacted so strongly when Trump later threatened to interfere with the opening. Snyder's response mattered because he was not some outside critic watching from a distance. He helped negotiate the original agreement and understood exactly how economically fragile the Detroit-Windsor corridor really is. Nearly 1/4 of all trade between Canada and the United States moves through this region, and much of that traffic revolves around automotive manufacturing, industrial machinery, agriculture, energy products, and integrated supply chains that function almost like a giant cross-border assembly line. A single vehicle produced by companies like Ford Motor Company, General Motors, or Stellantis may require parts to cross the Detroit-Windsor border multiple times before final assembly is complete. Engines, electronics, transmissions, steel components, and battery systems move back and forth constantly, meaning even short disruptions can ripple across factories within hours. When supply chains freeze, assembly plants stop, shipping schedules collapse, and costs explode incredibly fast. That vulnerability is exactly why the bridge became such a high-stakes issue long before Trump's threat ever appeared online. For decades, the Detroit-Windsor corridor relied overwhelmingly on a single truck-capable crossing, the Ambassador Bridge, originally opened in 1929 and privately owned by the Maroon family since 1979. Because the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel prohibits heavy commercial trucks, the Ambassador Bridge effectively became a near monopoly for freight traffic moving between the two countries, generating more than $60 million annually in toll revenue for years while controlling one of the most strategically important commercial choke points in North America. National security experts, logistics planners, automakers, and business groups repeatedly warned that relying on a single privately owned crossing created massive economic and security risks. One major accident, structural problem, labor disruption, or political standoff could jam supply chains for entire industries almost instantly. The push for a second publicly controlled crossing triggered years of resistance from the Maroon Empire, which spent enormous amounts of money trying to stop the project. Around 2012, the family backed a Michigan ballot initiative designed to force statewide voter approval for any new international bridge crossing, spending roughly $30 million promoting the effort. Voters rejected it by nearly a 60% to 40% margin, clearing one of the biggest obstacles standing in the project's way. Lawsuits followed next, arguing everything from exclusive crossing rights to permit challenges, but courts consistently rejected those attempts, including appeals the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear. Even during Trump's first presidency, television ads reportedly aired on Fox and Friends, urging him to kill the project entirely. He did not. That history suddenly became relevant again when reports surfaced claiming members of the Maroon family had recently met with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick shortly before Trump publicly threatened the bridge. According to reporting discussed by multiple outlets and lawmakers, Lutnick later contacted the president, and within hours, Trump was posting online about blocking the opening unless ownership arrangements changed. Michigan Democratic Representative Debbie Dingell said she had been informed about the meeting before Trump's announcement, although neither Lutnick nor the Maroon family publicly confirmed the details. Still, the timing fueled immediate speculation across Michigan because the economic winner in any bridge delay was obvious. If the Gordie Howe crossing stalled, the Ambassador Bridge monopoly remained intact. The backlash inside Michigan was unusually bipartisan because the economic consequences were impossible to ignore. Senator Alyssa Slotkin warned that blocking the project would hurt Michigan businesses and raise costs across supply chains already struggling with uncertainty. Governor Gretchen Whitmer emphasized that the bridge supports jobs, protects manufacturing, and strengthens economic cooperation between two deeply integrated economies. Even Republican figures who normally aligned with Trump expressed concern because the numbers were simply too large to dismiss. Roughly 8,000 trucks are expected to use the new bridge every day once fully operational, while around 6,000 Canadian workers are projected to cross daily into Detroit for employment opportunities. The crossing also creates something the old system never had: a direct freeway-to-freeway connection linking Ontario, Highway 401 with Interstate 75, eliminating the inefficient truck routing through Windsor city streets that currently slows commercial traffic and creates congestion. A University of Windsor study estimated the new bridge could reduce transit times for commercial trucks by up to 20 minutes per trip, That may not sound dramatic until you multiply it across thousands of trucks per day over decades of industrial activity. What surprised many observers most was how calmly Carney handled the confrontation once Trump's threat exploded into international headlines. There was no dramatic television showdown, no emotional speech attacking the White House, and no attempt to escalate tensions publicly. Instead, Carney reportedly called Trump directly the next morning and laid out several blunt facts. Canada financed the bridge. Michigan already shared ownership under the 2012 agreement. American steel and American workers were heavily involved in construction. The permits had already been granted years earlier. And most importantly, both economies needed the bridge operational because the economic logic behind the project had already been settled long ago. That response reflected Carney's broader political style, which tends to revolve around financial credibility and institutional stability rather than headline warfare. Before entering politics, Carney built his reputation navigating financial crises as governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, meaning he approaches disputes more like systemic risk calculations than ideological battles. Instead of framing the bridge solely as a nationalist issue, he emphasized how integrated the two economies had become and how dangerous it would be to weaponize infrastructure already tied to legally binding agreements. Later on Parliament Hill, he described the Gordie Howe crossing as a symbol of cooperation, trade resilience, and long-term economic planning rather than political leverage. Meanwhile, the factual dispute surrounding ownership collapsed almost immediately under scrutiny. Trump's claim that Canada owned both sides of the bridge contradicted the written 2012 agreement itself, along with statements from Rick Snyder and Michigan officials who helped negotiate the deal. The bridge is jointly owned by Canada and the state of Michigan, despite Canada financing construction costs up front. American labor was used. American steel was used. American customs facilities received funding support from Washington. The legal framework was already established more than a decade earlier and reinforced through multiple federal approvals. Construction never stopped because the contracts, permits, and financing mechanisms remained fully intact, regardless of political rhetoric. That is why business organizations across the region reacted so aggressively once the bridge became part of the political conversation. The Detroit Regional Chamber warned that any effort to block the project would create major consequences for Michigan, Canada, and the broader North American economy, because the crossing represents one of the most important infrastructure investments in the region's modern history. Labor unions, logistics companies, auto suppliers, and local governments echoed the same concern because they understood something politicians sometimes ignore during public disputes. Supply chains do not care about ideology, they care about predictability, speed, and stability. In the end, that may be the real reason Washington did not get the reaction it expected from Canada. Carney understood the bridge was already too economically embedded to be easily turned into a bargaining chip without hurting both sides at once. The legal agreements were already signed, the ownership structure already settled, the permits already approved, and billions had already been invested into construction. Delaying the opening would not suddenly create leverage out of thin air. It would mostly inject chaos into industries that Michigan itself depends on every single day, and honestly, that leaves some uncomfortable questions hanging over the entire situation. If this bridge was always designed to strengthen North American trade, why did it suddenly become a political weapon the moment wider trade tensions escalated? If Michigan already secured half ownership without financing the construction up front, what exactly would blocking the opening realistically accomplish besides protecting an aging monopoly crossing? And maybe the biggest question of all, when modern economies become this interconnected, can any country really afford to play power games with infrastructure that both sides need to survive? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this story goes way beyond one bridge sitting over the Detroit River. It touches trade, manufacturing, political influence, billion-dollar infrastructure, and the fragile reality of how dependent modern economies have become on a handful of critical routes staying open every single day. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, And turn on notifications because stories like this rarely end when the headlines disappear. See you in the next one.